I want to welcome you to the February 26, 2023 message here at Meadowbrook Baptist Church called The Winds and the Waves Obey Him, from Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. I'll never forget Halloween 1991. I was living in Minnesota, and we had what I would call an epic snowstorm that lasted from Halloween to early on November the 2nd. And dumped 31 inches of snow on the Twin Cities. The snow was so deep. How deep was it? Well, I'm glad you asked. It was up over the hood of my car. It was that deep. But the snowstorm in the upper Midwest was only part of a horrific weather weekend in our nation. Uh, a couple of days before Halloween, a tropical storm formed off the coast of Bermuda and began heading north-northwest towards the Atlantic seaboard. The closer it got, it picked up steam and became Hurricane Grace. I don't know if it actually made landfall or not, but the further it went north, people became more concerned because at the same time, there was a major cold front that was coming from the northeast area of the United States, headed towards Hurricane Grace. And people began to worry what was going to happen when these two weather systems collided. In fact, they began to warning that this had all the ingredients of the perfect storm. A few days before Halloween, Captain Tyre of the swordfish boat called the Andrea Gale set out to sea with his 5 crew members in hopes of getting one more late season catch of swordfish before the season was over. They set out from Gloucester, Massachusetts on a few days before Halloween. They were headed for the Newfoundland Bank. It's some area out there in the northeast Atlantic Sea area. There in Gloucester, by the way, they have a fisherman's memorial wall that has the names of over 5,300 sailors who left port but died at sea. Gloucester, Massachusetts, since 1623 has been one of the world's most busiest fishing ports. But on that day, a few days before Halloween of 1991, the captain and his 5 crew members of the Andrea Gale had no idea that they would not be returning. They made their way out, and they actually had a great catch of thousands of pounds of fish. But they went a little bit further out than they normally did. And as they started back, they discovered that they were not going to make it back to shore before the storm hit. In fact, as they started on their way back, they reported 92-mile-per-hour gust of wind out there on the Atlantic. And seas were averaging 30 feet high waves. In fact, during this storm, it was recorded on some of the buoys out there in the Atlantic, there in the Northeast, 100-foot waves. They'd never seen a storm like this in that area of the Atlantic. The Andrea Gale, with her 6 fishermen on board, would not make it home. The last radio message from Captain Tyne's radio before the radio went dead was, "She's coming on, boys, and she's coming on strong," talking about the storm. These 6 fishermen were victims of the perfect storm, and they became the focus of a book written by Sebastian Junger called The Perfect Storm. In fact, in 2000, The Perfect Storm was made into a movie starring George Clooney and Mark Wahlberg, which grossed $328 million. But I know if they had the chance, those 6 fishermen who lost their lives would have done anything not to be written about in a book about their death or in a movie depicting their tragedy. Perhaps in your life you've encountered more than a few perfect storms. You know, they say a perfect storm is kind of like an idiom that means when certain unfavorable circumstances kind of converge together, they form the perfect storm. As you look at your life, maybe you've never been caught out in a fishing boat in the middle of a stormy gale, but you have found yourself in the midst of many storms that were, I wouldn't call them perfect storms because they weren't perfect for us to go through, but nonetheless, you went through these storms. That's the way life is. There's many storms that comes upon each of us, even as Christians. What makes a difference in the midst of these perfect storms is whether or not you're in the boat with Jesus, because he is the one that has the power to command the winds and the waves and bring perfect calm even in the midst of life's worst storms, as we're going to see in Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. When Jesus is with his disciples and they find themselves in the midst of a storm in a boat out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. Let's read Mark 4, verses 35 through 41. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. And Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up and rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." Who is this? Who is this, folks? Who is this? You know, you might think that you know Jesus, but have you ever truly asked, who is this, when you are in the midst of the storm and you realize just how great and powerful he is? Last Sunday, we saw Jesus again at the beginning of Mark chapter 4, teaching a large crowd on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. In fact, we find a lot of Jesus' teaching time was in and around this famous Sea of Galilee. And the crowd was so large that once again they were pressing against him. And so he got into one of the fishing boats there, and he taught. And all day he taught. We looked at the parable of the sower and the seed, and there was a lot of teaching that went on as he sat in the boat. I imagine as the day wore on that he got tired, and we see that as we in our reading today. As evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." And it says, leaving the crowd behind. I don't know, I might be making more out of that phrase. But in life, sometimes we have to leave the crowd behind and go on with Jesus where he's calling us to go. Because the main thing in life is being with Jesus. And they leave the crowd behind. And it says they took him along just as he was in the boat. And Jesus had been sitting in the boat all day teaching, and he called for them to get in. They got in, and they went with him just as he had been sitting there in the boat all day. He said, let's go over to the other side. And so they begin the journey. You know, I've spent many hours on fishing boats. I grew up fishing a lot, and my dad had a little aluminum, I guess we call it a John boat. It's flat bottom aluminum boat, and with a little 5 horsepower gas motor and some little electric trolling motor. And we had a lot of fun in that boat. In fact, it's still over there in my dad's backyard. And of course, the trailer, I don't even know if the trailer would be able to move now. But a lot of time. And when I lived up in Minnesota, I spent a lot of time on my uncle's fishing boat, and he had a top of the line London Craft, I think it was, bass boat, and with all the bells and whistles. And I spent a lot of time fishing with him there on that boat in Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes and 1,000,000 mosquitoes. And I kid you not. Now, I would like to imagine this boat that Jesus gets in perhaps was one of Simon Peter's or Peter and Andrew's fishing boat, or maybe James and John's fishing boat, because it seemed like they had no problem getting in it. You might say long before the age of cars and travel buses, this was Jesus' ride, because we see them several times in the Gospel crossing back and forth from here to there across the Sea of Galilee in a boat. And something that was interesting, back in 1986, two brothers who had a fishing business there on the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee, the same area of where Peter and Andrew, James and John operated as fishermen. That there was two brothers back in 1986, fishermen that were out fishing and coming in on their boat. And that year of 1986, I guess there was a drought in Israel, and so the sea level was down, and the water went down a good little bit. And as they're coming back in from fishing, they see this outline of, it looks like a boat sunk in the mud. And they started looking at it, and they realized this is an ancient boat. And they called the authorities, and the authorities bring out the archaeologists from Israel and took it to the authority, or whatever it's called. And over a period of 12 days, they get this boat out, and they eventually wound up soaking this boat in wax for several years in order to preserve it from rotting. And you can go to a museum over there today and see this boat. What was interesting about this boat, it is dated, carbon dated, to 40 or 50 AD, around the time of Christ. Now, this may or may not be a boat that Jesus ever got in, but they actually have nicknamed it the Jesus boat. It's made out of cedar, and it's very interesting. And one of these days, I wouldn't mind going there. I'd tell you that. That'd be one of my dreams, to go to Israel. This boat that they found, which was typical of boats of that time, fishing boats, is 27 feet long, about maybe across this auditorium, width-wise, and 7 feet wide, and about 4 feet deep, about maybe up to my shoulders here as I'm sitting down in the auditorium. And they estimate about 15 adults would be able to fit into this boat. So certainly Jesus and his 12 apostles. And can you imagine? Jesus calls you and says, "Hey guys, let's everybody get on board. Let's cross over to the other side." And of course, he had already called these 12. We saw that back in Mark chapter 3, verse 14, I believe. And he had already called them to be with him, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach the gospel. And so this boat ride was just, again, another part of their life with Jesus, that he called them to be with him, to get in the boat with him, to get on board. And now he says, hey, let's go over to the other side. And actually, Jesus had a purpose in them crossing over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, because we see when he gets over there that that's where he runs into the demon-possessed man, and the man who is possessed by many demons. And when asked what the demon's name were, they say Legion, because we are many. And Jesus commanded the demons to go out into the pigs, and the pigs rushed down the hillside into the water. But, wouldn't it be amazing if Jesus said to you, hey, let's go take a boat ride. Come on, get in the boat with me. But that's exactly what Jesus is calling us to do. Now, I also noticed this week that it says as well, not only did Jesus get in the boat, let's go over to the other side. It says, leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. And then it says this, there were also other boats with him. It says there are also other boats with him. And I thought it could have read here, there were also other boats with their boat, but it says there are also other boats with him, that is Jesus. And there were others that may not have had Jesus in their boat, but they were with him. And they were also crossing over with Jesus. They wanted to follow Jesus. How exciting it is to be traveling with Jesus through this life, whether it's across the Sea of Galilee or down the interstate, that we answer the call that we have been called to travel with him, whether it's in a boat or whatever. Now, they're making this 8-mile voyage from the western side of the Sea of Galilee across to the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. And it'd be great to take a boat ride like that. I've actually been out on a lake about the size of the Sea of Galilee in Minnesota called Mille Lacs. In fact, it's probably a little bit bigger than the Sea of Galilee. But the Sea of Galilee is 13 miles long and 8 miles wide. It is the second lowest body of water in the world at 682 feet below sea level. The lowest body of water in the world is the Dead Sea, but this is the lowest freshwater body of water in the world. And it is surrounded on the west and northwest by the mountains of Galilee that have an elevation of about 1,400 feet, which would place them 2,000 feet over the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And then on the east is the Golan Heights. You probably might have heard that in the news. And the Golan Heights, they tower about 2,500 feet above sea level, so over 3,000 feet above the Sea of Galilee. Now, what sometimes happens there on the Sea of Galilee is there'll be a cold front come from the west-northwest. And when that wind from the north-northwest comes in, it comes crashing through the valleys of these mountains on on the west-northwest side. And in the Sea of Galilee below, the temperature there with the water is warmer. It's warmer air, and you have this cold air rushing in all of a sudden, and often unexpectedly, and it collides with this warm air, and it starts a turbulence. And in just a matter of seconds, you might be out on the Sea of Galilee and find yourself in a boatload, literally, of trouble. In fact, I understand that sometimes when these squalls or cold front winds come down, whistling through the valleys of the mountains of Galilee, that when these squalls stir, they can have waves that are 10 feet high or more. Now, remember, I said this boat that they found over there had 4-foot high sides. So, you can see what danger you would be in if you got caught out there when, it says here, a furious squall came up. Now, in this passage, you don't see it, but 3 times in this passage in Greek, it uses the word mega, which we know that means great, huge, great. And the first one is there's a great wind that comes up, this squall, this furious squall, this great cold front wind comes down, and it causes this turbulence. And then the second time that mega is used, it talks about calm, a mega calm. And the third time is when it says the disciples feared a great fear. So 3 times. And that's not by accident. It moves you from the great storm to the great calm to the great fear that results in great faith, or should result in great faith. Now, I can remember being out on Lake Mille Lacs a couple, 3 times, even up there when a storm front, cold front moved in. And we have some waves, maybe not 10 feet tall, but they might have been 6 or 7, 8 feet tall. And it gets kind of scary. And even though we had a bilge pump, a pump that would pump out the water that came in the boat, sometimes it had a hard time staying up. And here, the water, the waves, it says, are literally crashing against and over the sides of the boat. So the boat is being swamped with water, and it's filling up pretty quick. Now, keep in mind that at least 4 of these 12 men with Jesus were seasoned fishermen, seasoned sailors. They had been out on the Sea of Galilee many times. That's why it is of concern when they come to Jesus and said, "Don't you care if we're going to drown?" So if the fishermen, the professional sailors, are worried, guess what? I think I might be worried too. I read about a man named David Littlefield this past fall in September there in Tampa. In late September, he was sent a message or text by the owners of the marina where he had his boat docked that he needed to move his boat that day because you might recall Hurricane Ian was on its way barreling towards Florida. And so David Littlefield, instead of trying to get his boat hauled out of the water, he decided he would get on the boat and head south, thinking that he would be able to escape the onslaught of the coming of Hurricane Ian. The only problem was he didn't. And in fact, he got caught right in the middle of it. The water came over the edge of his boat and began filling his boat, and in fact, it was sinking, or is about to capsize. Actually, when all of a sudden he looked out the cabin window in which he was trapped, and he saw blue sky and light. And what had happened? He was in the middle of the eye of the storm, and so he climbed out the window. Thinking he didn't want to be trapped inside the boat and die. And soon, of course, the hurricane winds picked back up, and for 10 hours he clung to the hull of his boat. It's miraculous that he didn't get swept away as the rain beat on him for 10 hours. But then he was rescued the next day by a Coast Guard helicopter. You say, how crazy. But in our lives, sometimes because of our own foolishness, and most of the time quite unexpectedly, we find ourselves, maybe I would not say a perfect storm, but in an imperfect storm. It's not something you want. But you don't get to choose. These storms come. And you find yourself, even though you are with Christ, smack dab in the middle of a storm. Now, we may not be out in the middle of the sea with gale force winds beating down against us as we fear for our well-being, but sometimes we find ourselves in storms and situations where we think it'd be easier if I was out on a boat in the middle of a hurricane than going through this. We find ourselves wondering if we're going to lose our sanity and if we can take it anymore. The situation here was not lost on Jesus' disciples. This storm, these expert fishermen, rather. Now remember, it was also about evening. So it was not only storming, but it was dark. If you can't see and you're out there in the dark in the middle of a storm, that makes it even more difficult and scary. The waves, being 10 feet tall, they were at least 6 feet taller than the boat, if not more. And so you're looking up all around, you're surrounded by water, and it's splashing, it's spraying, and you think, we're going to die. But then look at Jesus. Look at Jesus there. And he, in the midst of the storm, what is Jesus? It says he was in the stern of the boat, asleep on the cushion. Now, this picture speaks to me in at least two ways. One was Jesus was tired. Jesus, even though he is the Son of God, he was also the Son of David. He was fully God and fully human. And he experienced what it meant to be tired. He'd been teaching all day. He was worn out. He was sleeping. He knew weariness. And of course, on the cross, he would know pain of beyond any pain you and I have ever experienced. But also, it speaks to me in another way that he was the Son of God. He was fully human, but also fully God, and he was at rest even in the midst of the storm. You see, Jesus didn't come to earth to die in an unexpected storm that came upon the Sea of Galilee. In fact, I believe there's a good chance or a good possibility that Jesus knew the storm was coming, but he wanted his disciples to know who he was. Now, have you ever known someone that could sleep through anything, including maybe an earthquake? During the summertime, a big loud thunderstorm can come through, and guess what? Patricia will say, "Man, wasn't that a lot of lightning or thunder last night?" I said, "There's a storm," But I believe Jesus knew the storm was coming, and he knew who he was, and he was at rest. But his disciples, he wanted them to know. He wanted his disciples to know who he was in the midst of this great unexpected storm. And the storms are going to come. But more than anything, the Lord wants to know he will be with us. Now, disciples in the meantime are freaking out. They don't know what's happening. They don't really realize who they are in the boat with. They didn't say, "Oh, shucks, we don't have anything to worry about. Jesus is here." In fact, they're questioning Jesus. How? They come to him and they said, "Don't you care?" He says, "Teacher, don't you care we're going if we drown? Don't you care if we drown?" Now, one, they didn't know the reality of their situation. Jesus knew that the storm was real, but he knew that he would save them and he had the power. But they, in their minds and the way that they're looking at it, and I can identify with this, sometimes in the midst of the storm, you think, "Oh, there's no hope. This plane's going to crash. My finances are going to crash, or my health is going to crash, or this is a hopeless situation." But we don't see it the way Jesus sees it. He is asleep in the stern of the ship on a cushion. But they go to him and they say, "Teacher, don't you care? Don't you care?" In their perspective, as professional fishers and sailors, they were going to drown. And they thought, "Jesus, how can you sleep through this? Don't you care? We're going to drown. What's wrong with you? Don't you care?" And what's the answer? Does Jesus care? Well, certainly he does. Certainly he does. He came down from heaven to die for us on the cross. Certainly Jesus cares this morning. You're in the midst of a storm. Yes, he cares. And he comes to deliver you from the greatest storm of life. Now, the greatest storm ever experienced was by Christ on the cross. The sky went pitch black as the sun stopped shining, as Jesus died for our sins on the cross. Yes, he cares, and if you're on board with Jesus, you can know that he is with you in the midst of any storm. And more than that, he has the power to bring great calm no matter what. I mean, it doesn't mean that the cancer is not real. It doesn't mean that the winds aren't real or there's not a hurricane. That stuff is real too. But in the midst of the storm, you can know that who you are going through life with, one way or the other, he is going to deliver you, and you can have complete calm. Jesus rising up, it says he gets up and he rebukes the wind and the waves. I can tell you, I've seen many storms here in central Illinois, and even high winds and tornadoes that have come through this area. And I have went outside before, and but I've never even dared to say, "Be calm, be quiet." I know that I don't have that power, but Jesus, when he got up, he spoke to the wind and the waves. He commanded it, and it became completely calm. But literally here, remember, I said there's 3 times that it uses the word mega. It says there was a great calm. Know this, folks, in the midst of any storm, there can be great calm when you put your great faith, or even a little bit of faith, in Jesus. Jesus has the power to command even the winds and the waves. Your life might be rocking back and forth and you're being tossed about, but folks, look to Jesus. Even then, he can bring great calm, knowing he will see you through. He's got this. We're in the boat with Jesus. Now, you've heard about the calm before the storm, but have you ever heard calm in the midst of the storm? Because Jesus gets up and he commands the wind and the rain, the waves rather, be quiet. And it becomes completely calm. There in verse 40, Jesus asked the disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Or you could say, "Do you still have no trust in me?" You know, they were in the boat with Jesus, but they didn't realize who he really is. That he is the creator. Only the creator can speak to creation itself and say, "Wind, stop. A wave, stop." Who has that kind of power through his word. Now, notice this. How does he stop? You know, he doesn't wave his hands, or hold them up, stop. He simply speaks and he says, "Be quiet, be still," and the wind and the waves stop and become completely calm. He says, "Do you still have no faith?" Verse 41 shows the response, and this is the third mega, the third great. It says they were terrified, but it literally says they feared a great fear. And sometimes in my life, as I've come, is in the midst of storms in my life, that I have really realized the most just who Jesus is to me. That he's my everything. And that if he doesn't have it, there's no hope. But I realize he is the one that created the winds and the rain and all this, and he has the power to command calm even in the midst of the storm. They feared a great fear, and they asked, "Who is this?" I mean, were they afraid of who they were in the boat with? Did they realize, wait a minute? Not only does he heal and cast out demons, he can speak to creation itself, and it obeys him? Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. I think back to Luke chapter 2 when the shepherds, an angel appears to the shepherds, and it says there, the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were sore afraid, but uses the same phrase, they feared a great fear. When you come into contact with the very presence, you realize, I am in the presence of someone much greater than myself. And you begin to see who Jesus is in all your glory. It's not unusual that you should literally be filled with awesome fear and awe of, wait a minute, this person I've been praying to, this person who I call upon, Jesus, he has the power to speak. I'm looking out the window right now. You can't see what I'm looking at, but he has the power to speak to the wind out there right now. Be calm. And then it stops. That's power, folks. Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. In the book of Psalms, there's a couple verses I want to read real quick that talks about who has the power literally to calm the seas. In Psalm 89, verses 8 through 9, it says, O Lord God Almighty, who is like you? You are mighty, O Lord, and your faithfulness surrounds you. You rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them. Jesus is God in the flesh. He proves here that he has power over creation. Psalm 107, verses 27 through 30. Now, this is amazing, I would say, prophecy. It speaks about a group of men. It says, they reeled and staggered like drunken men. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. The very words Jesus said, hush to the waves. And it says they were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Folks, more than ever, we need to ask, who is this? This is none other than God himself in the flesh, Jesus Christ, who died on the cross, rose from the dead, who did great miracles, who raised people from the dead, who healed the sick, but most important, he died for our sins on the cross, and he rose from the dead. He is God in the flesh, and he can speak to wind and the rain and the waves. And whatever you're going through right now, guess what? He's got this. And we've got to realize who he is. Rembrandt van Rijn in 1633 painted an awesome picture called Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee. It's a great painting. And it shows the 12 apostles with Jesus, and one end of the boat is tipped way up in the air, and Jesus in the back of the boat below. It shows him. And it shows literally one of the apostles is bent over the side of the boat. It looks like he's vomiting. It shows others straining, trying to control the sail and trying to bail water out. But then it shows the rest of them, like 6 of them or 7 of them. They're rushing with great fear in their eyes towards Jesus. And there's a light that comes from the right side, or actually the upper left side of the picture, and it's looking down at them, and then you see Jesus, the light in his face. Folks, in the midst of life, first of all, we've got to get on board with Jesus. Second of all, we need to look to him, not just in the midst of the storm, but we need to realize, who is this? He is God in the flesh. And in the midst of the storm, if we're looking for answers, we need to get closer to Jesus and draw near to him. Amen. Now, I also liked when I was growing up watching Gilligan's Island, and in the intro it shows these travelers, these tourists on a 3-hour tour, and the skipper was a mighty sailor man, the sailor brave and sure. If not for the something of the fearless crew, the minnow would be lost. And as I look at that little boat, the SS Minnow, I think, sometimes I feel like Gilligan, I'm on the boat and I'm trying, but I really have no clue. And no matter how I try, it seems like, whoa, it's going to crash. Or sometimes you think you're the skipper and you're brave and sure, and you think you know the answer, but then you still crash. Folks, in life, we need to realize I need to get off the SS Minnow of my own selfishness, my own plans, my own journey, and I need to realize I need to get on board with Jesus and realize I'm not on the SS Minnow. I'm on the good old gospel ship, and that Jesus is there, and I'm in the boat with Him. And I need to keep my eyes on Him as my captain and know that He will see me through because He is the one who commands even the wind and the waves, and they obey Him. Amen.